very nicely. So you heard her discussing the risks for the oil and natural gas sector. Let's look at it from another perspective. About half or maybe 60% of all the petroleum goes into automobiles. And we all know that there is this hue and cry about automobiles causing all this environmental pollution. It doesn't matter whether it's right, wrong, correct, incorrect, whether the percentages are right. All that doesn't matter. The fact is that the automobile industry is going to change. It's also true, coming from a macro perspective, that if the earth is to survive, then I think how much 2/3 of the oil, the coal and petroleum that we have in the earth must remain inside the earth. These two bits of information actually have a very deep bearing on where the oil and gas industry, or what the oil and gas industry needs to do in the future. So if all vehicles were to become electric at some point in time, it means 50% of your customers are gone. What would the industry do then? It would be fascinating to have somebody from the industry on the panel, but in the absence of that, maybe Arvind could hazard a guess on what perhaps the industry could do. And we'll throw it open to you once we've gone through the next question.
So that's the risk what automobile industry is, envisaging is, knee-jerk reaction from the governments. And Annapurna just shared with you the INDCs and 175 gigajoule of renewable power, or 30 to 35% of GDP, the emission cuts by certain time, next 7 to 10 years of time. Now, right now, government is not putting any limitations or any kind of mandate on anybody, but eventually, as we come closer to the timelines, those limitations or those limits would be put on the industry. And automobile industry, as there is a cry going on, which is the most polluting industry, I see that those caps will be put on automobile industry. What I can see is right now we don't talk about the tailpipe emission, but tomorrow definitely people are going to talk about tailpipe emission and what Europe and US those are doing. We will have to put some targets on carbon. Right now we are not measuring carbon, it's only the pollutants we are measuring, but tomorrow some cap will be put on tailpipe emission, which will be definitely derived out of the fuel consumption what we are going to have. So I can see that 120 125 gram per kilometer, that kind of target we will have, we may be put, and we, at that time, that point of time, if we start working, probably it will be too late. So maybe the automobile industry has started to think right now and start taking targets of that kind. Another thing is definitely tomorrow mass mobility is going to be a reality in urban areas, while rural area we still have a lot of scope. So the focus will shift from, like London has shifted, or Paris, or all other major cities in the world which has gone on the mass mobility. So something of that sort may come up in the urban area, and odd even is something which you have already seen. And although there is a debate going on whether infrastructure, but internally people know that this is something which is benefiting this thing. So middle class and upper middle class will have to think about it, and they may not be able to afford 2 cars, while people say that there will be an opportunity for automobile industry. But I don't see that. Everybody doesn't have a parking place, everybody doesn't have. So carpooling may happen, or people may not keep cars. I mean, Ola car and all those things which are coming up. So there is a risk which automobile industry is seeing, and I think we should imagine that we should start working on that today itself.
So let's switch to another very serious problem the earth faces, which is about 40% of the earth's emissions come from buildings. And about 70% of all the buildings that India needs by 2050 haven't been built yet. Which means if we keep building buildings the way we build buildings now, Wow, I didn't stutter on that one. Then the rate at which we will be doing emissions is going to be very, very high. So I've been very unfair to Ripin. He's been keeping quiet. He's a professor. I'm not sure he likes to be kept quiet. I would want him to come on this and talk to us about the future of sustainability in this area.
Thank you. I think my colleagues have made some fantastic points which have actually given me, my colleagues have made points here which have actually given me quite a few things to think about and comment on here really. And I think I'd like to touch upon this, including on the building side. Three things just to, I think that I'll make three quick statements and illustrate them with examples. The question of value chains, supply chains is becoming hugely important. And businesses are realizing that in order to sell, make profits, the one prerequisite is having a customer, somebody who's buying the service or buying the product. If you have no customer, you don't sell anything to anybody. Prudential, for instance, as a pension fund, decided that actually they would encourage, as part of somebody taking on an insurance policy, they would encourage gym memberships. So if you went to the gym regularly, then you got a rebate in your premium. Because they thought that if there were healthier people around, then they will have to pay less in payouts. And so suddenly the number of people going to gym subscriptions increased and went up. So that became an indicator. And this trend is telling us is that the customer, businesses who are really, really clever about sustainability are getting much, much closer in partnership with their customer, and also not just treating them as somebody to sell to, but somebody to partner with. I'll give another example. A big retail chain in the UK, Marks & Spencer, came up with a plan A for its carbon emission reduction. It said we didn't need a plan B because we can't afford a plan B, so we'll call it plan A. And they found that actually most of their emissions were coming from leakages in the air conditioning systems in their buildings, in their stores, but also they found that almost an equivalent or almost twice that amount was coming from customers driving to the stores, or customers, even more, ironing their shirts. So they started promoting non-iron shirts and fabrics and said, look here customers, you want us to be sustainable, but your role is also to iron your shirts less, so we can collectively reduce our upstream and downstream emissions. And I think that's a very good example of partnerships. In terms of my colleague mentioning about business resilience to disaster risk, and I think climate risks are very, very serious. And buildings, whole urban areas are very, very much more prone to flooding and so on. We've seen that in the case of Chennai, which had massive amount of precipitation this year, which is unprecedented. And that is, and also we saw the impact of Hudhud on the brand new airport on the east coast of India. And that airport really should have accounted for the cyclonic activity that came its way. One of the lessons, but how do cities learn? Cities learn or become smarter about this thing when they face a risk of losing business. For example, Bombay for years continued to say, oh, this is Bombay, when it rains, it's beautiful, and some of us sleep in the office, some of us sleep in our house, we can't get to work, but this is life in Bombay, come and enjoy it. But then suddenly they realized that actually the data section of the Metropolitan Police in the UK, the British Airways, Cathay Pacific, all these companies which had substantial data investments in Bombay and its suburbs said, we are going to withdraw our investment unless you fix the flooding in your city so our employees can get to work. The cities then started to invest in flooding measures or anti-flooding measures or flood prevention measures. And that is telling us something, because we are seeing the same pattern on business resilience across many cities. We're seeing it in Ho Chi Minh City, we see it in Mumbai, we're seeing it in Dhaka. Dhaka, in this case, because it gets flooded and it has very poor quality of water and so on, very polluted water, what is happening is that a lot of businesses, which are, the whole country primarily relies on the ready-made garment industry, the industry is starting to shift towards Vietnam. They're losing business to other cities. And cities are now competitors. They're not places to live anymore. They actually are businesses. So in order to attract investment, in order to prove investment worthy to their investors, I think cities are saying, yes, we'll be resilient, we'll make sure that we can deal with the heat waves, we can deal with the flooding and so on. And coming to the point of the buildings with the chair raised just now, I think it's an extremely important point, because at least I say, a professor of mine in Delhi used to say, don't work hard, please, just work smart. Because you can answer the same question in less words. You don't have to slog on it. And I think that's quite true. And to me, that definition of smart is quite important. So the really, really smart buildings, really, really smart cities are the ones which are leaner and actually answer the question rather than going around in circles, trying to do other things. Let me give you an example. I did a study with the World Bank in both housing demand in Asia as well as Africa. In the Asia bit, we focused mainly on India. We found that we looked at the National Housing Bank's estimates for affordable sector housing in India. We also looked at the demand coming out of, shown by HUTCO around what was the low income and affordable sector housing in India. It was in millions of units. We found by changing the design of one window, and I'm not joking here, I mean, this is what our calculations showed, changing the design of one window to face the right direction so that you would get sun and breeze, we calculated that 52 power plants, coal power plants, will not need to be built.
It's amazing.
So we are preventing the production of coal power plants. We are stopping that extraction from the earth by changing the design of one window. So next time you design a window, well, I say as an architect, hire an architect, but it is very, very important. If your building faces the right direction, it actually makes a huge difference across the country on the building supply chain and the amount of material and the amount of embodied energy in building materials. There's another example, which is one of my favorite ones, is that some years ago, this was 2006, a very big university in the UK approached us and said, we want to design a campus which is future-proofed for the next 30 years, so that we don't have to do any more building activity for the next 30 years. We can't afford any more building activity, and we just don't have the time. We want to concentrate on teaching. So we said, okay, what's your next question? And they said the next question is that how much space should we buy in the middle of London? It's very expensive, the space, so we just want to buy just enough so that it will last us for the next 30 years. And we're going to finance that project by selling off all the buildings that we have in and around London, and so the students don't travel in between buildings. So we did a study. For 6 months, I personally went and looked at every single room in every single building that the university had. We had occupancy surveys, which meant we looked at the numbers of how people were using the space and what the space was for. We made a list of every equipment. We found out that most of the equipment would be outdated because of the technology changing in the next 5-7 years. So the new types of equipment will come. It's getting smaller. Electronics was getting smaller, and so on. So we looked at a number of these trends. We also looked at the learning and teaching trends. Guess what we found out? We found out that actually most of the buildings of that university were being used at an occupancy of 8%. And that means that when we looked deeper into it, we found that more and more students were actually, because of Wi-Fi or the way the teaching and learning was happening, were studying from their hostels. They were working in cafes, not the classroom. The lectures were getting smaller, and the group work in library was getting bigger, and the teaching trends were changing. So we gave them a solution, which the governors were very happy with. The governors said, because the solution was that actually for the next 30 years, they need a campus which is 25% less in area than all their buildings combined together. So they were very happy because they could sell their buildings and still make enough profit to pay for the equipment and still pay for the new campus, which was 25% smaller than all the buildings combined. So I think in that sense, to me, smarter cities, smarter buildings, And coming back to the question that the chair raised, if we are talking about 70% of India's building not yet being built yet, should we be really, really getting into the detail here and start to think whether we only need 35% extra buildings? Or is it 50? Or is it really 70? Don't know the answer, but I think that's something to be looked at.
It's a fascinating perspective. I'm suspecting, Ripin, that some of the folks in the room are wondering where to sign up for your class now.
You're very welcome. I'll be just on.
So we've got another section to discuss, which is what would we consider as being success in sustainability going forward. But before, I was wondering whether that could be the last conversation that the panel had. And do you have a lot of questions to ask? Or is the panel doing a wonderful job? Okay. So why don't we have a couple of your questions before we get into that section?
You talked about the 6 planets we'll be requiring and the kind of thing. You think God should be invited here for the meeting here? Or?
He's called Ripin Kalra. You want to deal with that?
Well,
God.
I think that's the, yes, I think the, we are, human beings are schizophrenic. On one hand, we are very smart, we produce tools. But then we are we have been big risk takers. For a lot of the time in history, we've not understood, particularly in the industrial stages, that there are limits to growth. You need to limit the growth. You have carrying capacity, the sort of work which is now part of the day-to-day work of my colleague here. And I think, yes, there are, up till now, we know that all the all the scientists from IPCC are saying all the climate change is now irreversible. Only God can reverse it, if you like, to answer your question. But we cannot reverse climate change. We have to live with it. We have to adapt to it. We have to stop it going to a point now that things just fall apart. I always see the Earth as a very large boiler because it's got hot and cold water and air circulation, and it's just a heating system. And I think it's getting hotter and hotter. And so we do rely on some of goodwill from God to actually stop taking some of that risk now. I think really we should be stop taking some risks.
Sorry, just some numbers. The way we live now, it is understood that from a food security perspective, the maximum number of people the earth can support is 10 billion. We're close to about 7 now. It is also understood that if all of us had the carbon footprint that an average American has, then the world can support 1.5 billion population. We are at 7 now. If we were to have the same carbon footprint as the average European has, then the world can support 2.5 billion as population. Clearly, if we as a nation and China and Africa were to develop in the same way as Europe and the US has, the world will not survive. So there are things to do, which is why we're talking about sustainability the way we are. So that's the sort of numbers that we are dealing with. So you had a question.
India has made certain commitments in Paris for reduction of emissions and all that by 2030. So what are the steps being taken right now in India to move forward in that direction? Thank you.
Who would want to take that? Indra, are you?
So I mean, Annapurna would be the right person to answer that because she represents TERI. But individual industry-wise, we can add to what it is. But at a national level, who is doing what? Maybe.
No, just as I had mentioned in the note that the INDCs, there are a couple of things. If you would look at the INDCs on the website, there are certain actions that the government has committed. The first action was that we move from conventional fuel to renewable energy. So they have stipulated that 1.7 gigawatts of energy will be from renewable energy, and out of that, the first thing that they are doing is 40% of this is solar rooftop, which is very easily achievable. The other 60% we do not know how it's going to be achieved, but solar rooftop is going to go in a big way. And as Ripin mentioned, buildings, There will be an emphasis on all buildings to be more efficient. And let me just give you an example of this, which TERI itself has. 32 kilometers from here in Gurgaon, we have a building which is a 5-star complex, which is devoid of the conventional grid of Haryana. It completely uses renewable energy and indigenous knowledge, which is that there is a complete tunnel dug, and it's the law of physics that there is an air exchange during winters and summers, very briefly put it. And this allows the rooms to be air cooled or air heated in summer or winter, vice versa it gets. And that building actually uses 1/3 of the energy that a conventional 5-star like this would use. And it is a 5-star complex where corporates do their trainings there. So there are examples which the government of India will now enforce to meet these commitments.
Yeah. Can I add to this? Just a point over here. I mean, just because of our association with some of the departments in the government as well, what we see is there is a lot of focus on channelizing certain funds, GCF fund, and there is a National Adaptation Fund also, through which government is trying to identify certain initiative at a state level. You may recall that there were state action plan on climate change that was created some time back. All the state governments had to submit it to the central government. Now what they're doing is they are trying to identify certain priority projects at the state level, which they're going to fund. Now the fund is routed through either some IFI or some, maybe it may be DFID or maybe GIZ playing a role somewhere. So I don't want to get into the specific routes or channels, but there is a concrete initiative from the government to push or channelize funds to the right projects, the priority projects in each of the states, and to drive those. And these projects are both in the area of mitigation, as well as there is a lot of attention that adaptation is right now getting. Adaptation initiatives in the agriculture area, in the water harvesting area, even in certain areas like husbandry, animal husbandry and all, they are also getting a lot of attention. So that's from the government. I can see that there is a lot of initiative, but for the INDC commitments that we have, I think it is going to take some time to translate all these figures, all these targets, all these aspirations into specific actions for the government as well as the industry. The initial, the policy, the framework, that has to be definitely driven by the government, and then it has to percolate to specific industry sectors. We are familiar with the PAT regulation that had come in earlier. That was targeted at 9 of the industry sectors. So similar thing may be taking shape once these particular targets get some kind of a shape and some kind of an action plan behind each of them.
To your question, it will take a long time to answer because thankfully India is doing a lot of good things. And the commitments we made to achieve by 2020, we are one of the few countries who are on track to achieve it. So that's good news. And within our INDCs, actually what we want to do and how we want to do have been built in. A very simple one is the solar program or the renewable energy program which Annapurna talked about. There's another bit which is about afforestation. And like you said, sir, can we bring God? The fact of the matter is when carbon is up there, you have no choice but to sequester it. And the best way to sequester it is through trees. And that's why afforestation is mentioned in our INDC. You might wonder, oh, पेड़ लगाएंगे किधर? The interesting part of India is the forest department has lots of land where there are no trees. So those are the best place to put up the trees. And there are many, many more steps like this. Okay, we will go for another question, but before that I will request the panel, because we'll come back to you, to help us define what can be considered as success in the area of sustainability. So if you could keep a point or two ready, because when we come back to you, we'll have very little time left. Okay, any other question?
Yeah, this question is to Indra, Guha, and maybe it can be answered by any of the panelists also. You talked about the board level sustainability. There's a gap between what is actually at the maybe plant level and how it has been emphasized to a more greater level from the board level sustainability. Here I'd like to know 2 points from you. In such a business risk scenario which many industries are facing, sometimes it happens that sustainability takes a backseat, especially at the board level, because there are more challenges in their own economic performance, which may not have a full-time view on the sustainability aspirations to be done. And second, how do you want to go about to address some of these gaps, which may be having a legally mandated sustainability reporting, or maybe because now as per SEBI guidelines only
the BRR is also there. For the top 500.
Yes, top 500. So now how do you think it can be protected more, especially with the INDC coming into picture, that how can many organizations, even in the MSME, can take this as maybe a way forward from a sustainability point of view?
I think, in my opinion, one has to break the silo. It's still operating in a silo particularly in some of the organizations. It's still being treated as a separate, it's some kind of a cost center that it is being looked at in many organizations. So what the best thing would be to integrate sustainability into business and maybe call it business sustainability, and build the sustainability risks into the risk matrix of the organization. So in the risk analysis that gets done for any organization, the sustainability risks need to be captured over there. It has a huge impact. Probably you might have come across the Johnson news that came in the newspaper. After so many years, the baby powder that is attracting a huge amount of flack. It has caused cancer, and probably some kind of analysis, some kind of laboratory analysis was missed out long ages back, and the impact is being seen right now. So one should not ignore something just because of some cash flow that is going to come in, or just focus on the business benefits rather than take into consideration